The road to Kintyre Crag was no road at all. It was a jagged wound in the earth, a bruised expanse of stone beneath a sky the colour of churned pewter. As the lone black carriage ground up the cliffside path, the fog drenched the manor and the moor stretched into an endless, suffocating grey. Rain lashed sideways, needling the windows as the wheels sank into mud as thick as treacle. Each turn of the axle groaning like the earth itself was protesting the intrusion. Inside the jolting carriage, Lady Elara Vance sat with the rigid poise of a woman who refused to be rattled by weather, fate, or men. Her gloved fingers curled around a velvet case of glass vials. Her tools, her livelihood, and her last tether to the world that had cast her out. She did not fear the storm. To a woman who had survived the cutthroat perfume markets of London, a little Scottish thunder was merely a poorly played drum. As she exhaled, her breath fogged the rain-streaked window, blurring her reflection, a pale, sharp-eyed, unbowed ghost of her former self. London had taught her that the most dangerous storms were rarely made of water. They wore silk, they whispered, and they smiled as they pushed you toward the abyss. She had once walked the polished corridors of Mayfair, and she used that same tempered confidence now to brace herself against the carriage's violent sway. She had been a Londoner in every sense, sharp-tongued, sharp-minded, and sharpened by a city with an insatiable appetite for gossip. She knew how to read a ballroom the way a general read a battlefield. She knew which smiles concealed knives and which men mistook her intelligence for mere ornamentation. And she knew, with painful clarity, how quickly London devoured its own. Her exile had not been a fall from grace, it had been a shove. A crack of lightning revealed the manor ahead. Perched on the cliff like a gargoyle carved from the night itself, its faintly glowing windows looked awake and watching. They said the cellars of Kintyre Crag held more ghosts than wine, but for Elara Vance, a woman whose nose could detect a lie in a bouquet of lilies, the damp air of the Macinnis estate smelled of something far more intoxicating, an ancient, neglected truth. The carriage shuddered to a stop. Above, stone gargoyles with mossy wings stared down in judgment. When the driver opened the door, the storm seized her cloak like a trophy, but she stepped into the mud with queenly dignity, despite the accusing squelch of her boots. Pulling her cloak tighter, her soul skidding against the jagged, unkempt stones, she looked up at the looming manor and then back at the endless stretch of gravel she'd just endured. If the Earl's heart is as welcoming as his treacherous driveway, she muttered to the wind, I shall require sturdier boots and a significantly higher fee. The massive doors groaned open to an interior colder than the storm. A leaden scent struck her immediately. High ceilings and peeling wallpaper layered with damp wool, expensive beeswax, salt, old books, and the heavy, fermenting tang of grapes. It was a house steeped in memory, a house that had not forgotten. Elara had been summoned by a man who lived in the shadows of his own history. Sir Elan Macinnis, the Earl of Kintyre Crag. Rumours painted him as a recluse, a tyrant, a ghost haunting his own halls. Inside, the manor breathed with a heavy, Gothic melancholy, every shadow seemingly holding its breath. Then, she saw him. Standing by a hearth that struggled to warm the cavernous room was Sir Elan Macinnis, a man made of edges. Tall and severe, he looked as though he had been carved from the same granite as the cliffs outside. A jagged scar ran from his temple to his jaw, catching the firelight like a blade. His eyes were dark, unreadable, and entirely unwelcoming. Yet, beneath the severity, he bore the weight of a man accustomed to company who had long since learned to live without it. His clothes were impeccably tailored but worn at the cuffs, as if he dressed from habit rather than vanity. His posture was rigid, not from arrogance, but from a lifelong vigilance. He did not need to command the room, he simply was the room. Elara removed her soaked cloak with deliberate grace, refusing to be diminished by Scottish weather or the man before her. Sir Elan's voice was as rough as grinding stone. You are late, Miss Vance, and you look like a drowned bird. I expected a scholar, not a bedraggled London socialite. Elara's tone turned smooth and mocking. And I expected a gentleman, my lord. Instead, I find a hermit who greets guests like tax collectors. If my appearance offends you, do stare at the wall. I hear the damp patches have excellent character. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He turned sharply, snatching a decanter of 1794 Madeira and pouring the deep, amber liquid into 2 crystal glasses. The crystal clinked against the mahogany, followed by a soft, elegant glug that echoed through the silence like a benediction. He didn't offer her a chair, he offered her a challenge, pushing a glass toward her. "I'm paying for your nose, Miss Vance, not your tongue," he said. "Identify this. If you are the expert the London merchants claim, tell me what sits in that glass. Fail, and you may find your way back to the cliffs tonight." Elara didn't flinch. She lifted the glass with priestess-like reverence, swirling it with practiced, languid grace. The amber liquid coated the glass like velvet. She didn't just smell the wine, she felt the year it was born. 1794 Madeira, she said, her voice steady and sure. "Fortified, much like your defences, Lord Macinnes. I detect the sweetness of a raisin that gave up on life, the bitterness of charred oak, and a peculiar note of iron." She took a tiny, daring sip and looked him dead in the eye. "Tell me, my lord, did the vintner bleed into the vat, or is that simply the taste of your family secrets fermenting in the dark? It's a bold choice for a welcome drink. A bit like serving a guest a loaded pistol." She sipped again, unblinking. "You have a dangerous mouth, Miss Vance," Sorellen murmured, his voice low and dangerous. "And you," she replied coolly, "have a cellar full of ghosts you're too afraid to name. We shall get along famously, provided you don't expect me to curtsy to your gloom." Sorellen's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer into the candlelight. The air between them didn't just spark, it caught fire. He hadn't been truly seen in 10 years, and here was a woman who had just read his soul through a single ounce of fermented grape. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, resonant intensity. "The cellar is yours to catalogue, Miss Vance. But stay away from the North Rack. Some vintages are meant to stay buried, like the people who bottled them." The tension shattered as a rotund, cheerful man burst into the room, tripping over a rug. In waddled Lord Barnaby the Nose, sporting a bright yellow waistcoat that clashed so offensively with the Gothic room it should have been illegal in Scotland. Lord Barnaby let out a booming laugh, his eyes twinkling with mischievous delight. "Aho! A spark! I can smell the ozone." "Sorellen, stop scaring the poor girl." He swept toward Elara. "Elara darling, come quickly, the 1802 sherry is behaving like a jilted opera singer. It's positively temperamental. I've tried singing to it, but it only tastes more like disappointment." Elara laughed, a soft, surprised sound that warmed the room more than the fire ever could. "Lead the way, Lord Barnaby. I've always had a soft spot for temperamental spirits. They're so much more honest than the quiet ones." And so, the first cork was pulled. The decanting had begun. But as Elara followed the eccentric Lord Barnaby toward the dark stairs of the cellar, she felt Sorellen's gaze on her back, a gaze as lingering and complex as the wine she had just tasted. As they disappeared into the manor's depths, the shadows along the walls seemed to shift, leaning in to listen. Outside, the storm raged, but a different kind of storm had begun within. Deep beneath the manor, in a cellar older than the Macinnes lineage, a single bottle sealed in black wax trembled on its shelf. The forbidden vintage had sensed her arrival. The rhythmic thud-thud of Elara's damp boots on the stone floor sounded like a heartbeat against the silence of the great hall. The space was a cavern of forgotten grandeur, with tapestries heavy with the dust of decades and timber beams curving overhead like the ribs of a stranded whale. "Don't mind Sorellen," Lord Barnaby whispered, his voice bouncing off the cold stone. "He's forgotten that people aren't like casks of wine. You can't leave them in the dark for 20 years and expect them to improve. He's gone sour, I'm afraid. Or perhaps, just volatile." Elara glanced back. The Duke was still a silhouette of sharp angles against the dying orange glow of the hearth. She felt a prickle of heat at the back of her neck, the feeling of being hunted, or perhaps, for the first time in years, the feeling of being truly seen. Barnaby pushed open a set of double doors, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. If the manor was a tomb, this was a cathedral. The tasting room was lined with glass-fronted cabinets holding thousands of bottles with labels yellowed like dead leaves. "The Kintyre Crag Collection," Barnaby announced proudly. 3 centuries of sunlight trapped in glass. "But something is wrong, Miss Vance. Terribly wrong. The wine is turning." Elara approached the long mahogany table, her exhaustion forgotten. She opened her velvet case, the glass vials clinking softly, her own pharmacy of dried bergamot, crushed peppercorn, and damp earth. She picked up the decanter of 1802 sherry. She didn't drink, she simply hovered her nose over the rim. "It's not turning," Elara said, her voice dropping to a professional murmur. "It's morning." She tilted the glass, watching the liquid swirl. It should have been a bright, nutty amber, glowing with clarity. Instead, it was a dull, bruised brown, as if the life had been bled from it. "There is an acidity here that shouldn't exist," she said. "It tastes of copper and ozone, as if the storm outside has found its way into the bottle." A poetic diagnosis. "Miss Vance." Sorellen's voice cut through the room. He had followed them with predatory silence. He leaned against the doorframe, his scarred face half hidden in shadow. "But I didn't hire a poet. I hired a chemist. Tell me why my legacy is rotting in the cellar, or take your queenly dignity back to the mud." Elara set the decanter down with a sharp clack. "Wine is a living thing, Your Grace. It breathes, it ages, and it reacts to its environment. If this house is full of bitterness and secrets, why should the wine be any different? You've closed this cellar off from the world. No fresh air, no life. You've turned your heritage into a morgue." Sorellen stepped into the light, a dangerous simmer in his eyes. The wine remained perfect through 2 Jacobite risings and a dozen family tragedies. "It did not sour because of my mood, Miss Vance. It began to change 3 nights ago, the exact moment you crossed the border into Scotland." The room grew unnaturally still. "Are you accusing me of witchcraft, Your Grace?" Elara asked with a sharp, cold smile. "I'm accusing you of being a catalyst," Sorellen replied. "Barnaby thinks you are here to save the sherry. I know why you are really here. You're looking for the black wax. The forbidden vintage." At the mention of the black wax, Lord Barnaby went pale, fidgeting with his buttons. Now, Sorellen, the black wax is a myth. A legend to keep the stable boys from thieving." "It is no myth," Elara said softly, her eyes locked on Sorellen's. "The 1715 lost orphan. Bottled during the Great Eclipse, sealed with wax mixed with the blood of the land. They say one sip allows a person to see the truth of their own soul, and another lets them change it." Sorellen walked toward her until he was standing far too close. She could smell the Madeira on his breath, mixed with rain and old wood. Up close, she saw the weariness in the lines around his eyes. He wasn't just a tyrant, he was a guardian of something that was breaking him. "London cast you out because you told the truth about a countess's parentage after smelling a drop of wine on her breath," Sorellen whispered. "You have a gift for unmasking lies. But here, Miss Vance, the lies are all we have left. If you break the seal on the black wax, you won't just find the truth. You'll wake things that have been sleeping since the cliffs were formed." The Duke turned on his heel and vanished into the shadows, his heavy coat swirling like a shroud. Lord Barnaby offered a weak, apologetic smile. He's had a difficult few years, my dear. The room at the top of the East Tower has been prepared. Try not to listen to the walls, they're just settling." Hours later, Elara lay in a massive 4-poster bed, the silk sheets feeling like ice against her skin. The storm had reached a crescendo, the wind howling through the battlements like a choir of the damned. She thought of the vials in her case and the Duke's scarred face. She reached out and touched the stone wall beside her bed. It was vibrating, not from the wind but from a low rhythmic pulsing coming from deep beneath the floorboards. First impressions are often just the cork. You must breathe to find the truth. In the cellar, the bottle with the black wax didn't just tremble. It began to sweat. Small, dark beads of liquid seeped through the porous glass, smelling of ancient earth and forgotten sins. The road to Kintyre Crag had ended, but the descent into its heart had only just begun. Elara closed her eyes, and for the first time in years she didn't dream of London. She dreamt of a dark red sea and a man standing on the shore, waiting for the tide to come in. If the library was the brain of Kintyre Crag, then the cellar was its dark, thumping heart, a place where secrets aged in silence and the air itself felt thick enough to chew. To enter the cellar was to leave the 18th century behind and step into something much older, something subterranean and primal. Heavy stone footsteps echoing, slow dripping water. The stone steps spiraled downward, slick with centuries of damp and the weeping of the earth. With every step, the warmth of the manor's hearths faded, replaced by a chill that didn't just touch the skin, it sank into the bone. The world narrowed into a labyrinth of oak, iron, and shadow. Lord Barnaby descended ahead of her, his bright yellow waistcoat glowing like a confused sun swallowed by the gloom. The deeper they went, the more the air changed. It grew cooler, denser, tinged with the scent of cork dust, old grapes, and something older still, the quiet ache of time. A bottle clinking softly against a rack. Lord Barnaby stopped beside a massive barrel, the wood stained a deep, bruised purple. He patted it with the lingering affection of a man greeting a beloved hound. Lord Barnaby, jovial and a bit too loud for the space, says, "Now, Elara, my dear, do be gentle with the claret. It's had a dreadfully sensitive morning. I think it's still brooding over the Napoleonic Wars. I tried cheering it with a sea shanty, but it only turned more tannic. Dreadfully stubborn, the French vintages, don't you think?" Elara, wry and amused but keeping her voice level, replies, "Perhaps it simply prefers a more sophisticated audience, Lord Barnaby. I've often found that a silent cellar is the only place one can hear oneself think, mostly because the bottles are the only things in this house that don't talk back." Lord Barnaby's lantern retreated into the distance, a bobbing amber spark that left Elara in a sea of velvet ink. The cellar wasn't just a room, it was a subterranean geography, a map of forgotten summers and winters long since buried. Heavy, wet dripping in the distance. The sound of Elara's breathing, slightly quickened. A distant, metallic groan. She didn't follow the light. Instead, she let her hand trail along the rough-hewn stone of the north wall. The rock was weeping, beads of mineral-heavy water that tasted, if one were brave enough to try, of iron and ancient lime. Every few feet, the air would swirl, caught in a draught from some unseen chimney or a crack in the foundation that reached all the way to the moor above. In those draughts, she could hear the storm, not as a roar, but as a low-frequency hum, the earth itself vibrating under the lashing rain. Elara fell quiet, her thoughts slipping into a soft, whispered rhythm, more to herself than anyone else. 92 steps from the stairs. The temperature has dropped exactly 4 degrees. The humidity is rising. I'm not in a wine cellar anymore. I'm in a lung. And it's breathing. She raised her own small taper. The light didn't push back the dark. It only carved out a small, jagged hole in it. Within that circle of light, she saw the soldiers. A sharp, crystalline ting as her ring hits a bottle. They were bottles from the 1700s, standing in rigid, dusty rows. They weren't lying on their sides like the pampered clarets. They stood upright, like a silent militia guarding the deeper darkness. The glass was thick, bubbled with imperfections, and coated in a grey-white mold that looked like lace. Elara murmured to herself, her voice trembling just slightly. 1745. The Jacobite bottles. Still standing guard. If I pull one of you out, will the whole wall come down? Or will you just tell me who died to keep you full? She reached for a bottle. The glass felt unnaturally cold, like ice that refused to melt, when a sudden, sharp crack echoed from the darkness behind her. The sound of a heavy wooden crate splintering. It wasn't Barnaby. It was too heavy, too deliberate. The sound of a boot turning on grit. Someone was moving in the aisles of the unlabeled. Someone who didn't need a lantern. Lord Barnaby laughed, a high, delighted sound that echoed too long in the low-hanging rafters. He bustled off into a side tunnel, muttering about proper social lubrication. Left alone, Elara let her gaze wander. The shadows here weren't stagnant, they seemed to pulse. Her lantern light flickered, casting long, skeletal fingers across the floor. A sound of a low, ghostly moan of wind through a vent. A shelf caught her attention, tucked away behind a stack of rotting crates. The north rack. A heavy iron grate covered it, secured by a rusted padlock that looked older than the manor itself. The air shifted here. It didn't smell like wine. It smelled like stagnant time, like wet copper, and something else. Something waiting. From the shadows, Sorellen's voice came, sudden, low, and vibrating with authority. I told you to stay away from that corner, Miss Vance. Curiosity is a vintage that often turns to vinegar before it can be enjoyed. Sorellen Macinnis appeared in the archway, his silhouette blocking the flickering torchlight. The shadows clung to him as though they recognized their own. Elara turned slowly, refusing to be startled. Elara's voice was direct, edged with challenge. And I told you, my lord, that I have a nose for secrets. This rack isn't merely locked, it's haunted. There's a bottle in there, obsidian glass, and it's practically screaming. Bitter almonds. Something metallic. Not blood. Guilt. He stepped closer. Close enough that she could smell the sandalwood on his coat and the ozone of the storm air clinging to his hair. Sorellen's voice dropped to a whisper, dangerous and intimate, as though meant for her alone. It is a bottle of the obsidian tears. Do you know why the glass is so dark, Miss Vance? It wasn't blown by a craftsman. It was forged in the fires of a betrayal that nearly burned this crag to the ground. A low, rhythmic drum-like heartbeat of the house. Sorellen continued, his voice steady, measured with quiet authority. In 1745, my ancestor, Alistair Macinnis, commissioned a vintage for his bride. A wine so sweet it was said to taste of liquid sunlight. But on the morning of the wedding, he found her in the arms of his own brother. Alistair didn't scream. He didn't reach for a blade. He went to the cellar, to this rack. Sorellen's voice dropped, becoming a rough rasp that seemed to vibrate against the stone walls. He opened every bottle of the wedding vintage and bled into the vats. Not enough to kill him, just enough to stain the harvest. He added hemlock, nightshade, and the crushed petals of the black rose. He recorked them himself. At the feast, he watched his bride raise the glass to her lips. She took one sip, looked him in the eye, and wept a single tear of black ink before her heart simply stopped. A sharp, high-pitched ringing that fades into the wind. Sorellen's voice was quiet, but heavy with meaning. The wine didn't just kill her, it claimed her. They say the remaining bottles are no longer liquid. They are the condensed grief of a man who loved too much and a woman who lied too well. It is not a secret, Miss Vance. It is a curse that breathes in the dark. Elara's voice dropped to a sharp, defiant whisper. A tragic ghost story, my lord. Truly. But ghosts don't use high-grade industrial adhesive. I've seen the glue on these labels, my lord. It's fresh. It's barely dry. She stepped into his space, her eyes reflecting the orange flicker of his torch. Elara's voice was steady, edged with quiet defiance. Someone didn't want the obsidian tears hidden because of a 200-year-old curse. They wanted it replaced. They're using your family's ghost story to hide a very modern crime. Someone is bleeding the cellar dry, bottle by bottle, and replacing them with shadows and fake ink. Now, the question is, are you the one holding the glue, or are you just too afraid of the ghosts to notice? Lord Barnaby bustled back into the main vault, his face flushed with the triumph of a man who had successfully negotiated with a beverage. In his left hand, he cradled a dust-caked bottle of sherry as if it were a fragile infant. Lord Barnaby's voice rang out with sudden delight, bright and triumphant. Ah! Success! The 1802 sherry has finally stopped its infernal sulking. It's now positively giddy, practically whistling a sea shanty. But oh, Elara, do be careful near the Pinot Noir on the middle rack. It's been in a foul mood since the Regency era. Elara stepped away from Sorellen, the tension between them snapping like a dry twig. She turned to the rack Barnaby was pointing at, a collection of slender, elegant bottles that seemed to lean away from the rest of the cellar. Elara let out a faint, amused breath as she adjusted her spectacles. Foul-tempered. Lord Barnaby? It's a grape, not a governess. Lord Barnaby replied at once, utterly delighted with himself. Precisely. And that's the problem. It's a French governess. It finds my waistcoat garish and your boots dreadfully functional. I once tried to move it to a sunnier shelf, and I swear the cork popped itself out of pure spite. It's terribly judgmental about footwork and even worse about conversation. Elara leaned in close to the Pinot Noir. She didn't touch it. She simply looked at it, her reflection warped in the dark green glass. Elara bent slightly, her voice dropping to a soft, conspiratorial whisper as if the bottle might answer her. You don't like my boots, do you? Too much mud from the moors. Not enough silk from the salon? Elara straightened, turning toward Barnaby, her tone now more focused. You're right, Barnaby. It's vibrating. But it's not judging my boots. It's judging the air. Look at the sediment. It's settled in a spiral, not a flat line. This bottle hasn't just been sitting here. It's been listened to. Sorellen, who had been watching from the shadows of the north rack, stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. Sorellen's voice cut in, cool and edged with quiet disbelief. What are you implying, Miss Vance? That the wine is eavesdropping? Elara's voice steadied, gaining a quiet, thoughtful intensity. I'm implying that this cellar is a resonator. The stone, the glass, the liquid, it's all one giant ear. If you stand exactly here, next to your judgmental Pinot, the acoustics of the library upstairs funnel down through the ventilation ducts. You don't need a key to know the master's secrets, Lord Barnaby. You just need to know which vintage likes to gossip. Sorellen vanished into the shadows as though the darkness had simply opened its mouth and swallowed him whole. Elara watched the spot where he had been, her fingers still tingling. She looked back at the locked north rack. The fermentation was complete. The sugars were turning to alcohol. The silence was turning to a scream. The pressure was building. And she, alone, had the courage to uncork what came next. A final, metallic clank of the padlock. The echo of Sorellen's footsteps faded into the damp corners of the north rack, leaving Elara alone with the silent, judgmental Pinot Noir and the weight of the obsidian tears. She looked at her hands, still cold from the touch of the ancient glass. Elara's voice softened, reflective but steady. Barnaby was right, in his own eccentric way. The wine doesn't just age, it remembers. But the lesson of the cellar isn't about the price of the vintage or the prestige of the label. She picked up her small taper, the flame dancing in the draught. Elara's voice took on a quiet, reflective gravity. The lesson is this: darkness doesn't just hide things, it preserves them. Secrets, like the finest Bordeaux, require time and silence to develop their true character. But if you leave them in the dark for too long, they don't become valuable, they become vinegar. They turn sharp, acidic, and eventually, they eat through the very cork that's meant to contain them. She looked back at the Jacobite soldiers, those 1745 bottles still standing in their rigid, dusty rows. Elara's voice deepened with quiet conviction, reflective and steady as her thoughts unfolded. We think we are the masters of the cellar, choosing which bottle to open and which to keep buried. But in truth, the cellar masters us. It teaches us that you cannot possess a secret without it eventually possessing you. To taste the truth, you have to be willing to break the seal, and once the air hits it, there is no going back to the dark. The north cellar of Kintyre Crag lay in pitch darkness, the air thick with the scent of ozone and ancient sugar. A violent flash of lightning split the heavens, a jagged white scar tearing across the sky. For a single, blinding heartbeat, the manor silhouette loomed like a wounded beast clinging to the cliffside. Then came the shatter, a window upstairs giving way with a scream of glass flung inward by the gale. The storm did not merely break over Kintyre Crag, it declared war. The few modern lamps flickered, sputtered, and died with a hiss of defeated copper. The manor exhaled a long, mournful groan as the wind forced its way through every crack and forgotten corridor. In the bowels of the cellar, Elara Vance was swallowed by a velvet blackness so complete it felt alive. The air smelled of wet stone, ancient dust, and the faint metallic tang of fear. Elara whispered to herself, her voice trembling just slightly. It's just darkness. You've navigated worse than a highland storm. Don't let the shadows win. Rainwater finding its way through the old ceiling. She struck a flint. A small spark flared, and in that brief orange glow, she saw him. Sorellen McInnes. Standing mere inches away in the narrow aisle. Silent. Immovable. A shadow carved from the storm itself. Elara drew in a sharp, breathless breath, then recovered just as quickly, her tone snapping into dry. Good heavens, my lord. Do you always haunt the hallways like a vengeful spirit, or is it simply your hobby to terrify the help during a blackout? You nearly cost me my heartbeat. Sorellen's voice was low, almost vibrating in the tight confines around them, as if the space itself carried it. This is my house, Miss Vance. I know every shadow, and at present you are standing in the darkest of them. You shouldn't be down here when the sky is screaming. The stone remembers too much. It tends to repeat the old tragedies when the lightning strikes. Elara's tone turned dry, touched with faint incredulity. Tragedies. It's a wine cellar, my lord, not a mausoleum. Sorellen's voice was low, carrying a calm, somber certainty. In this house there is very little difference. A massive thunderclap rolls overhead, the sound of dust and grit falling from the rafters onto glass bottles for a moment. Elara wondered if the entire manor might simply surrender to the storm and collapse into the sea. He took the flint from her hand. His fingers were cold, but where they brushed hers the air sizzled with a heat that had nothing to do with the storm. The scratch of a match, the hiss of a candle flame catching as he lit a thick tallow candle. The flame wavered, weak and golden, casting long distorted silhouettes of bottles across the walls like a silent, judgmental jury. Sorellen reached for a bottle resting on a nearby table, a deep blood-red Syrah, its label stained by time. Sorellen's voice remained low, but now carried a practical edge as he assessed their situation. The temperature is dropping, he muttered. The manor is old, and it bleeds heat the moment the fires go out. If we remain here, we'll freeze before Barnaby finds his way back with the lantern. He's likely distracted by a loose floorboard or his own reflection. He poured the wine into 2 mismatched crystal glasses. The hollow clink of crystals, the liquid glug of the pour. They sat on a dusty packing crate. Drink this, Sorellen added. A Shiraz from the southern slopes. It's aggressive, much like yourself. It doesn't ask for permission to be noticed. Elara savored the first sip, her expression shifting as her tone sharpened with amused confidence. Aggressive. I prefer to think of myself as highly structured with a long, uncompromising finish. And this wine. It's arrogant, my lord. It thinks it's a king when it's barely a duke. It's trying too hard to hide its youth behind all that oak. It tastes like desperation. Like a man trying to bury a secret under a layer of expensive wood. Sorellen let out a rare dark chuckle, though it never reached his eyes. His voice remained low as he spoke. You mock my wine, yet you drink it as though it's the only thing keeping you alive. Tell me, Miss Vance, what is it you're truly looking for in my cellar? Are you cataloguing my vintages or my sins? Because I assure you, the sins are far more numerous and they leave a much more bitter aftertaste. The candlelight trembled as another gust rattled the cellar door. Shadows stretched and recoiled like startled animals. Elara stepped closer, the air between them tightening with a quiet electric tension that made the hair on her arm stand up. Her voice remained calm, but edged with defiance. Perhaps I'm simply trying to wash away the taste of the lies you've been feeding me, my lord. Why is the obsidian tears hidden behind a false wall of 19th century brick? And why does the label smell of fresh oak gall ink when the bottle claims to be 3 centuries old? It's a forgery, my lord. A beautiful, dangerous forgery. Who are you protecting? Sorellen set his glass down with a sharp clack. He stepped into her space, forcing her gently, but unmistakably back against a wine rack. The iron was cold against her spine, but his presence was a furnace. The maceration had begun. The skins were soaking, the polite veneer dissolving into the raw, dark fruit of their desire. Sorellen's voice roughened, his composure slipping as something raw broke through. Because that bottle contains the proof that my father did not steal the king's jewels. He was framed by the very general who is at this moment marching toward these gates. That fresh ink is a map, Lady Elara. A map drawn in the only ink that survives the damp. A mixture of iron gall and bitterness. If that bottle falls into the general's hands, the machinist's name is extinguished forever. His breath mingled with hers, warm and unsteady. I am not protecting a lie. I am protecting the only truth I have left. The candle flame gutted, as though eavesdropping on a confession. It wasn't meant to hear. Elara's breath softened as she lifted a hand to his scarred cheek, her voice gentle yet unyielding. Then let the general come. Let the gates burn. But don't let the truth turn to vinegar in your veins, my lord. You've spent 10 years acting like the villain the world wants you to be. You're not the monster, my lord. You're just a vintage that's been kept in the dark for far too long. And even the most complex notes are hidden behind the bitterest skins. For a moment Sorellen's eyes softened just enough for the storm to slip inside. The Macinnes family had always whispered of the royal secret flames. A mythic fire said to ignite only when truth and ruin collided. And in that narrow aisle with thunder shaking the bones of the manor, Elara could swear she saw the first spark of it flicker behind his gaze. Their faces hovered inches apart. The slow burn was over. The flame had caught. Sorellen's hand slid into her hair, pulling her closer. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision of loneliness, of longing, of two sharp minds finally surrendering to the inevitable. It tasted of salt, syrah, and a desperate, intoxicating hope. A massive roll of thunder directly overhead, the sound of several bottles clinking together in a rhythmic shimmer. The world narrowed to heat and breath until a loud, frantic banging echoed from the cellar door. Lord Barnaby's voice echoed in from somewhere beyond the darkness, panic-stricken and muffled by distance. "Sorellen. Elara. Are you dead? I found a lantern, but I've also found the 1810 port. And it's being dreadfully pessimistic. It says we're all going to be arrested by the king's men. Also, I've dropped my cheese. It's a catastrophe of the highest order. The brie is compromised. I repeat, the brie is compromised. It's gone into a crack in the floorboards and I can't reach it without a fork." Elara pulled away, a soft laugh escaping her despite herself. Her tone turned lightly amused. "It seems your cousin's timing is as impeccable as his waistcoat collection." Sorellen's eyes still burned with the remnants of the kiss, his voice low, threaded with dark amusement. "He is fortunate he is my only relative. Or I would have bottled him years ago and left him in the north rack to rot alongside the cork vinegar." The heavy door creaked open. Lantern light spilled in, cold and unforgiving. The moment dissolved, but the taste of it lingered on their lips. Timing is everything. A bottle opened too soon is a tragedy, but one opened too late becomes a ghost. The cellar was a wreckage of history. Shards of glass from lesser vintages crunched under the soldiers' boots, a rhythmic, crystalline weeping for the house of Macinnes. The air was thick with the metallic tang of old blood and new iron. The storm above had quieted to a distant murmur, but its fury lingered in the stones, humming like a memory that refused to fade. The heavy, rhythmic thud of military boots on stone stairs. The clank of sabers against thighs. The storm outside was a mere whisper compared to the tempest that now breached the north cellar. The heavy oak doors were thrown back with violence that rattled the 17th century racks. Shadows of tall men in mud-streaked scarlet spilled across the floor, elongated and predatory in the flickering torchlight. The cellar doors burst open, and a flood of torchlight spilled across the stone floor. Heavy boots thundered down the steps. At the front of the pack stood General Aldrich Vance. No relation to Elara, though he shared her sharp, cutting eyes, except him, held no warmth, only ambition sharpened to a blade. General Vance stepped forward. He was a man with a face like cold iron, his eyes reflecting the hunger of a wolf that had been scenting its prey for a decade. Behind him, his men held torches that turned the thousands of glass bottles into a hall of mirrors, thousands of eyes watching the final act. His cold voice like a grinding gravel. "The king's jewels, Macinnes. Hand over the obsidian tears, or I shall have my men drain every cask in this cellar into the mud. I will leave Kintyre Crag as dry as a desert and as silent as a tomb." The torches flickered against the thousands of glass bottles, turning the cellar into a hall of mirrors, each reflection of a distorted echo of danger. General Vance, his voice shook, strained with a desperate, almost manic authority as he barked the order. "What are you waiting for? Secure the treasure." Sorellen stepped in front of Elara without hesitation. His gaze did not waver. His hand rested on the hilt of a decorative dagger. His eyes burned with a dark, ancestral fire, yet his voice remained steady and composed. "You seek a ghost, General." His voice was steady, almost indifferent, as though the answer had been waiting long before the question was asked. A flicker of something darker passed across his expression. My father died with his secrets. He let the words linger, heavy with memory. Then, with unshakable finality, he added, and I shall do the same. This cellar is a sanctuary, not a trophy room for thieves in uniform. The soldiers shifted, ready to strike. The room went deathly still. A silence so heavy it felt as though the very stones of Kintyre Crag were leaning in to listen. But before Sir Ellen could strike, Elara stepped forward. She didn't flinch. Her boots were crunching softly on the grit of the cellar floor as she reached for the bottle. She cradled the glass, which looked like a vessel and more like a captured piece of the night sky. Wait. The single word landed like a command, not a plea. Her voice cut cleanly through the tension like a whip crack. She flicked her eyes to the bottle, then back to the general, steady and unflinching. General, if you break that bottle. She let the warning hang for just a heartbeat, the weight of consequence settling in the air. Then, with quiet, undeniable certainty, you break the only thing that can save your own neck. A murmur rippled through the soldiers. I have spent 10 days inhaling the history of these racks, General. I have nosed every lie you've tried to ferment here. And I have found the note you were too arrogant to scent. She positioned the obsidian tears directly between the general's eyes and the flickering orange of a soldier's torch. The liquid inside did not behave like wine. It didn't catch the light with ruby brilliance or golden clarity. It was an ink-black void, thick and viscous, clinging to the glass like tar. The room fell silent. Even Lord Barnaby froze mid-fuss over his tragically dropped cheese. Elara inhaled, slowly, deliberately, drawing the air in as though it carried secrets meant only for her. When she spoke, her voice was calm and precise. Each word was measured. You claim this bottle was a wedding gift from the king to the Macinnis line. A royal treasure. Her gaze drifted to the glass, studying it with quiet intensity, as though it might betray its own lie. But look at the glass, General. A faint pause. A subtle shift in her tone, now edged with certainty. It wasn't blown in the royal furnaces of London. It carries the jagged, dark impurities of the Black Forest. Her eyes lifted again, meeting theirs, holding them there. Then softer, more dangerous for its restraint. And the seal. She did not finish the thought. Instead, Elara extended her hand. Sir Ellen, give me your dagger. He handed it to her without question. She scraped the wax seal. A soft hiss escaped as the air hit the content. A puff of pale blue powder beneath the wax drifted into the air, unmistakable, deadly. Elara turned to the general, her voice dripping with elegant mockery. This isn't wine, General. It never was. It's a chemical compound, a slow-acting poison that leaves no trace, but the scent of bitter almonds and a heart that simply forgets to beat. A vaporous toxin known as the King's Mercy. In 1685, it was a crime of high treason to even possess this formula, for it was the tool of the assassins, not the vintners. She stepped closer, the truth cascading now. Sir Ellen's father didn't steal the jewels. Your ancestors, General, used the Macinnis cellar as a laboratory for shadows. They hid the toxins they used to eliminate the king's rivals behind the reputation of an honorable house. Knowing the Macinnis line would be too proud to ever break the king's seal. To keep this bottle in Kintyre Crag wasn't a choice for Sir Ellen's father. It was a hostage situation. He was the gaoler of your family's sins, waiting for someone with a nose sharp enough to smell the rot. She held the bottle out before them, not as an offering, but as a judgment. When Elara spoke, her voice was low, unwavering, stripped of doubt. The obsidian tears isn't a treasure. A brief pause. It's a confession. The general lunged, a desperate snarl ripping from his throat. He didn't want the treasure, he wanted the evidence destroyed. But Sir Ellen was faster. The cellar erupted into chaos. A bottle shattered, not the obsidian tears, but a cheap table wine that splashed across the stones like spilled blood. Sir Ellen slammed the general against the iron bars of the north rack, disarming him and pinning him with the strength of a man defending his legacy. Amidst the wreckage of history and the metallic tang of old blood, one voice remained tethered to the truly important things in life. Lord Barnaby brandished a heavy bottle of port like a club, gesturing wildly at a broken crate. I say, if you're going to arrest a man for high treason, do try not to break the 1810 port. It's far too dignified for a common brawl. And for heaven's sake, watch the cheese. It's an heirloom Stilton. The absurdity broke the final, brittle tension. The soldiers paused, their bayonets lowering. They looked at the ink-black bottle, then at their general, whose face was a mask of purple-veined fury. The general's own men, loyal to the crown's law rather than a traitor's legacy, wrenched his arms behind his back. You fools! I am the crown! Vance screamed, his voice cracking. That bottle is a lie. Kintyre Crag will burn for this. His curses faded into the upper reaches of the manor, a bitter sediment being filtered out of the house like fog retreating before a Highland sun. As they dragged him away, the oppressive weight that had hung over the Mackinist line for generations began to lift, like a cork finally easing free after decades of pressure. The lies had been exposed. The truth was no longer fermenting in the dark. It had been decanted. For the first time in generations, the cellar master was free. The distant, fading sound of military boots ascended the stairs. The heavy oak doors groaned shut. The soft settling of dusk, shaken loose by violence, drifted through the air. And then, a long, profound silence followed, a silence so complete it felt ceremonial. Elara, her voice a weary whisper, set the obsidian tears down with trembling hands. It's over, Sorellen. The skins have been pressed. There's nothing left to hide. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from the enormity of what had just been unburied. The bottle glowed faintly in the lantern light, its wax seal shimmering like a secret finally ready to speak. Sorellen leaned heavily against the rack, his breath ragged as the weight of the decade finally caught up to him. I spent 10 years waiting for this moment, he said, his voice low and unsteady. I thought the truth would feel like a victory. I thought I'd want to roar from the cliffs. Instead, it just feels quiet. Elara stepped into his space, her voice dropping to a tender whisper meant only for him. The most complex truths are never lost, they are merely fermenting. You thought you were protecting a secret, but you were actually just waiting for the sediment to settle so the wine could finally run clear. You aren't the monster of Kintyre Crag, Sorellen. You are just the cellar master of your own grief, guarding a vintage that was never meant to stay bottled. Sorellen looked at her, his eyes searching hers for an answer he wasn't sure he wanted. The storm had carved him hollow, but in that hollow space, something new flickered. Something fragile. Something alive. And what happens to the cellar master, he asked thoughtfully, when the cellar is empty of its secrets? He learns to live in the light, Elara replied with quiet conviction. He learns that some things are better shared than guarded. The Mackinist family had long whispered of the royal secret flames, a mythic fire said to ignite only when truth, loyalty, and sacrifice converged. It was a fire that did not burn the flesh, but the lies that clung to it. The fire isn't in the bottle, she added. It's the courage to open it. In the dim lantern glow, Elara could swear she saw that ancient spark kindling behind Sorellen's eyes. His voice dropped to a low, almost reverent vibration. I've spent my life guarding the bottle, Elara. But you were the only one brave enough to decant it. You didn't just save my name. You saved my soul. A small, weary smile touched Elara's lips. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers finally warm against his. The cellar, once a tomb of secrets, felt suddenly like a sanctuary. Above them, the thunder rolled one last time, not a roar of war, but a deep, resonant sound that felt, for the first time, like applause. Elara stilled, listening intently. Listen. Do you hear that? The rain? Sorellen asked, uncertain. No, Elara whispered, hushed with awe. The house. It's finally breathing. And it was. The stones seemed to sigh with relief. The wooden beams, long burdened by the weight of unspoken truths, creaked softly like old bones stretching after a long sleep. Even the air felt warmer, as though the manor itself had stepped out from beneath a shadow. Lord Barnaby, still fussing over the cheese, muttered something about culinary war crimes, but even his theatrics felt gentler now, like comic relief after a tragedy that had finally found its ending. Sorellen's grip tightened around Elara's hand, grounding himself in the moment. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the quietness. To trust it. Somewhere deep in the shadows of the north rack, a single bottle, the 1685 Obsidian Tears, settled into its niche with a soft, satisfied chime against the stone, as though acknowledging that its purpose had been fulfilled. As the first light of a storm-washed dawn touched the high windows of the manor, the stones of Kintyre Crag seemed to sigh. The long finish had begun. A vintage opened too late is a ghost, but a vintage opened at the perfect moment becomes a legend. The long finish reveals everything, the truth, the flaws, the beauty. For in the end, what lingers on the tongue is what was always hidden in the bottle. And in the quiet heart of Kintyre Crag, beneath the storm-washed stones, a legend was exactly what had been born. As the first light of a storm-washed dawn touched the high windows of the manor, the stones of Kintyre Crag seemed to sigh. The cellar felt different once the soldiers were gone. The air, once thick with a metallic tang of fear, now carried the cool, salt-licked scent of the morning sea. The torches had been extinguished, the heavy boots silenced, and the traitor dragged out into the dying remains of the tempest. What remained was a strange, trembling quiet, the kind that follows a long-held breath finally released. For the first time since Elara had arrived at Kintyre Crag, the atmosphere felt lighter. Not warm, not yet. The stones were still cold, but the suffocating pressure of a century of secrets had vanished. Lord Barnaby was the first to break the heavy stillness. He knelt mournfully beside the remains of his dropped cheese, his voice dropping into a tragic, theatrical baritone, cradling a jagged wedge of blue-veined dairy as though it were a fallen comrade on a battlefield. Alas, poor Stilton, he lamented with a heavy sigh. I knew him well. A noble rind, a courageous cream, cut down in the prime of its pungency. Elara let out a laugh. A soft, exhausted sound that rippled through the stone chamber like a pebble dropped in a deep well. Sorellen turned toward her. The pale stormlight filtered down the stairwell, framing him in silver and softening the harsh, defensive lines of his face. He looked different now, not unburdened, but unmasked. When he spoke, his voice was low and raw, stripped of its usual defensive armor. You saved my home, Elara, he said, the words vibrating with a quiet intensity. My name. Everything my father died to protect, and everything I nearly lost trying to hide it. Elara stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm, as she brushed the dust of 3 centuries from her skirts. I didn't save anything, Sorellen. I simply told the truth. You were the one brave enough to stand there and face it. He studied her then, his gaze searching hers. You speak of bravery as though it's a simple vintage, he replied, his tone hushed and thoughtful. As though you haven't been walking through my shadows since the moment you stepped off that carriage. Elara offered him a soft, knowing smile, her voice dropping to a playful whisper. Someone had to, Sorellen. You were far too comfortable in the dark. It's a terrible place for a man with your eyes.
It's you in that sundress on weekends in early April, spring. Your eyes in the sunset where the beach ends and sand beneath our feet. Your laugh in the morning and the evening when we can't fall asleep. It's anywhere, it's anything. Loving you comes naturally. So naturally.
Suddenly, a booming, artificial cough echoed through the racks as Lord Barnaby rose to his feet. If you two are quite finished smouldering at one another, and believe me, the heat is enough to spoil the Riesling, he announced in a bright, jovial tone. I propose a celebration. A proper tasting. Something jubilant, something triumphant. Something that won't try to poison us or confess to a capital crime. He began to rummage through a nearby rack with the manic enthusiasm of a man searching for buried gold. Bottles clinked and dust flew until he emerged, his voice muffled and excited from behind a wall of oak. "Ah! The 1780 celebration cuve. It's been waiting for a moment exactly like this, though I must warn you," he added, his voice rising in a mock warning. "It tends to pop its cork prematurely when it senses excitement in the room." Elara bit back a laugh as Sir Ellen pinched the bridge of his nose, a gesture of weary affection for his eccentric cousin. His voice strained with fond exasperation. "Barnaby, perhaps something a bit less volatile?" "Nonsense." Barnaby shot back in a high, mischievous lilt. "Volatile wines are the most honest. They leap before they think, much like you two." He waggled his eyebrows with scandalous intent. Elara felt the heat rise to her cheeks, and even in the dim light, Sir Ellen's ears turned a distinct shade of crimson. Barnaby, satisfied with the romantic chaos he'd sown, bustled away to fetch the proper crystal. As Barnaby's humming echoed from the next aisle, Sir Ellen stepped into Elara's space. His voice dropped to a low, intimate vibration meant only for her ears. "When this storm finally passes, when the king hears the truth of what was hidden here, I don't know what comes next for Kintyre Crag. I've been a ghost in my own house for so long. I've forgotten how to be a host." Elara tilted her head, her voice steady and melodic. "And what comes next for you, Sir Ellen Mackinnis?" He hesitated, the pause of a man unused to speaking his heart, afraid that the words might break the fragile peace of the morning. His voice hoarse and uncertain. "That depends on whether you intend to leave the moment your cataloguing is complete. The cellar is organized, Elara. Your work is technically done." Elara reached out, her fingers finding his. Her voice was warm and grounding as she spoke. "I've catalogued your bottles, Sir Ellen. I've read the labels and the corks. But I haven't finished reading you. And I suspect your story has a much longer finish than any of these vintages." Sir Ellen's breath caught. "Then stay," he whispered, his voice thick with sudden hope. "At least until the sun is high enough to burn the last of the shadows away. At least until the last bottle is uncorked. Only if you promise not to hide any more secrets behind rusted padlocks," Elara replied, her tone light but lingering. "And only if you promise not to run toward every locked door you see," he countered with a faint, dry chuckle. "No promises, Sir Ellen. A sommelier has to follow her nose," Elara said, her voice bright with a daring edge. Lord Barnaby returned, radiant in his bright yellow waistcoat. In the growing light, the Regency finery of the three friends seemed to glow, lace, gold embroidery, and the bubbles of the champagne mingling in a scene that felt both timeless and tender. Lord Barnaby's voice triumphant and loud as he lifted 3 glasses of the effervescent 1780 cuve. "To truth, to triumph, and to the two of you finally kissing. Oh, don't look so shocked. I heard the tension through the door. Very operatic. The Pinot Noir will be insufferable about it for weeks." Elara nearly choked on her bubbly, her laughter breathless and bright, while Sir Ellen let out a long, resonant groan. "Barnaby," but they raised their glasses regardless. Together. As the liquid gold hit the glass, the story reached its final note. Clarification reveals what fermentation obscures. When the storm finally settles, the truth stands clear, bold, bright, and impossible to ignore. The sound of 3 glasses clinking, a warm, resonant chime that fades into the sound of the morning tide. A lingering note, warm and haunting, meant to stay on the tongue long after the final word. The storm did not leave Kintyre Crag with a final thunderclap, but with a soft, lingering sigh that settled over the cliffs like a velvet shroud. By dawn, the fury had been washed away, leaving the ancient stone walls glistening like dark obsidian against a pale, watery Scottish sun. The air was transformed, no longer heavy with the suffocating musk of old secrets and damp earth, but bright with the sharp, clean scent of wet heather, sea salt, and the faintest, ghostly trace of peat smoke from the hearths that had burned through the long, violent hours of the night. For the first time in centuries, the manor felt unburdened. The shadows that once clung to the rafters like thick cobwebs had retreated into the corners, chased out by a light that felt honest, even if it was cold. The very stones of the castle seemed to breathe again, exhaling the dampness of the past and inhaling the promise of the new day. Elara stood alone on the cliffside terrace, her heavy traveling cloak fluttering in the restless wind like a ribbon of spilled ink. Below her, the North Sea remained in a state of primal agitation. Its silver-grey waves churned and crashed against the jagged rocks of the crag, sending sprays of mist upward as if the ocean was still locked in a heated argument with the storm that had passed. She watched the horizon, where the line between the sky and the water was blurred by a lingering, ethereal haze. The sound of footsteps broke her reverie, steady, rhythmic, and heavy with a familiarity that had grown over the course of her harrowing stay. She didn't need to turn to know it was Sorellen. He stopped beside her, close enough that the radiating warmth of his presence acted as a shield against the biting morning air. For a long, profound moment, they watched the horizon in a shared, comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between two people who have stared into the same darkness and survived it. It was Sorellen who eventually broke the quiet. His voice was a low, rough vibration, gravelly from lack of sleep and the weight of the news he carried. "The king's messenger arrived at dawn," he said, his eyes fixed on the silver horizon where the first light was breaking through the cloud cover. "The charges against my father have been cleared. The estate is restored to the lineage in full. The crown sends its apologies." Elara offered a small, knowing smile, her gaze still tracing the whitecaps below. "Apologies from a throne rarely come without a bitter note," she murmured, her voice catching the wind. "A sharp tannin that puckers the mouth. But at least this one was bottled properly. It has the seal of truth upon it." Sorellen turned to her then, the wind tugging at his dark hair and casting shadows across the hollows of his cheeks. His expression was unreadable, caught between the relief of a restored name and the uncertainty of a vacant future. "You could leave now," he said, his voice dropping even lower, testing the empty air between them. "Your work is done. The cellar is catalogued. The truth is free of its cobwebs. You owe me nothing, Elara. Not a single hour more." Elara looked back out over the churning silver of the sea, feeling the spray on her face. She didn't speak of debt, or contracts, or the professional reputation of a sommelier. Instead, she turned to meet his gaze, her eyes bright with a new, steady fire. "Some vintages aren't meant to be tasted once and forgotten," she said softly, her words deliberate and weighted. "Some require a rare kind of patience. They require time. A willingness to let them breathe, to let the air soften their edges until they reveal their true character." She saw his breath catch in the cold morning air, a visible plume of white that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "And what of us, Elara?" he asked, the question hanging heavy and fragile between them. "What vintage are we?" Elara stepped closer, the distance between them vanishing until she could feel the steady, thrumming beat of his heart through his coat. "A forbidden one," she whispered, her eyes locked onto his. "A rare, singular harvest. The kind that lingers on the palate long after the glass is empty and the fire has gone out." The moment was a fragile thread of connection, a heartbeat away from a different kind of ending, until the heavy oak terrace doors burst open with a cheerful, rhythmic clatter that echoed off the stone arches. Lord Barnaby appeared like a burst of sunlight, puffing with exertion but beaming with an irrepressible triumph. He was resplendent in a bright yellow waistcoat that seemed to mock the muted, grey-blue colours of the Scottish morning. In his hands, he hoisted a dust-covered bottle with a pristine gold seal as if it were a holy relic. "There you are," he cried, his voice booming with a playful, scandalized energy. "The 1812 Phoenix Grand Reserve refuses to be uncorked without a proper audience. It claims it's far too magnificent for private affairs, and frankly, I think the bottle is starting to sulk. It's quite jealous of your little rooftop rendezvous." Elara's laughter rang out, a clear, musical sound that seemed to startle a parliament of gulls circling the cliffs. Sorellen let out a mock groan, a sound of feigned annoyance that couldn't quite hide the genuine twitch of a smile at the corners of his mouth. Barnaby was undeterred, gesturing wildly toward the great hall. "Come along, you two. This vintage was saved specifically for the day the shadows lifted. If we don't drink it now, while the air is still crisp, it will undoubtedly harbor a grudge for another century. And I, for one, haven't the time to wait." As Barnaby retreated back toward the warmth of the manor, his laughter trailing behind him like a bright ribbon, Sorellen reached out. His fingers intertwined with Elara's on the cold, damp stone of the balustrade. "Stay," he said, his voice barely more than a breath against the shell of her ear, stripped of his usual nobility and reduced to a simple, honest plea. Not because of the cellar. Not because of the storm or the laws of the land. Stay because I want you to. Elara didn't answer with words immediately. She leaned in, the scent of the sea and the heather swirling around them, and brushed her lips against his cheek, a soft, lingering promise that tasted of salt, cold air, and the beginning of hope. Then pour the wine, Sir Ellen, she whispered against his skin, her hand tightening around his. I'm not going anywhere. Together, they turned away from the edge of the cliff and walked back into the warm, candlelit heart of Kintyre Crag Manor. The storm's chill fades behind them as the golden light spills across the stone floor, their silhouettes softened by the glow of hearth and chandelier. The house was the same structure of stone and timber, yet it felt entirely different. It was no longer a tomb of guarded secrets or a museum of tragedies, but a home beginning to be warmed by the sound of genuine laughter and the slow, velvety bloom of a future yet to be written. They had learned the final, most enduring lesson of the sommelier. The rarest and most precious vintages in the world are not the ones locked away in the dark, dusty corners of a cellar. They are the ones brave enough to finally be brought into the light and uncorked. The tide crashes against the Scottish cliffs, each wave echoing through the hollow stone like a memory refusing to fade. The wind claws at the shutters, its cry sharp and ancient. Slowly, the storm exhales, its breath softens, its rhythm slows. The chill dissolves into warmth. The air thickens with sunlight and the scent of olives. The wind becomes a whisper through dry leaves, and the world hums, not with fury, but with life. Cicadas pulse in steady cadence, their song weaving through the golden afternoon like a heartbeat rediscovered. 10 years had passed since the storm at Kintyre Crag. The dark, oppressive stones of the North Rack were gone, faded now into a memory as distant as a half-forgotten dream. The mists of the highlands had been traded for the relentless, golden clarity of the Tuscan sun. Here, the world did not hide its secrets in shadows. It wore them openly in the emerald ribbons of grapevines that stretched across the rolling hills like a promise kept. Two figures walked hand in hand between the rows. Elara's gown, a soft linen the color of cream, glowed in the afternoon light as she turned toward her companion. Beside her, Sir Ellen walked with an easy, unburdened stride. He was no longer the Sommelier of Shadows. He was a man who had finally learned how to live in the light. Ahead of them, a stone pergola draped in lavender-heavy wisteria offered a canopy of violet-tinted shade. At the center of the wooden table sat a single, unlabeled bottle of deep, translucent red. It wasn't a royal treasure or a stolen poison. It was their own creation, a vintage born of patience and a love that had survived the frost. A young child, Alistair darted past them, a blur of energy chasing a butterfly that flickered through the vines like a living jewel. Elara watched the boy, her smile softening with a warmth that seemed to radiate from within. Sir Ellen, look at your son. Elara beamed, her voice bright with a quiet, melodic laughter. He has your stubbornness. He'll be trying to prune the Sangioves before he can even reach the bottom wire. And speaking of stubbornness, Lord Barnaby has sent another letter. He says the new claret at Kintyre Crag is feeling homesick and practically begging us to visit Scotland to cheer it up. Sir Ellen slipped an arm around her waist, pulling her close as they reached the shaded table. Tell Barnaby the claret will have to wait, Sir Ellen replied, his voice warm and steady as he looked out over their domain. I'm busy savoring a vintage that took me 30 years to find, and I don't intend to look away for even a moment. They sat together as the sun began its slow, majestic descent. The wine in their glasses gleamed like liquid rubies, catching the molten gold of the horizon. Their love was no longer a frantic, flickering flame in a drafty cellar. It was a steady, radiant heat, a glow that warmed the world rather than consuming it. Sir Ellen lifted his glass, his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that had never wavered. To the long finish, Elara, and to the secrets that brought us together in the dark, so we could find our way to this. Elara lifted her glass in a mocking, playful tone, a familiar spark of wit dancing in her eyes. And to the wine, my lord, even the rude ones. The crystal met with a soft, silver chime that echoed through the quiet vineyard. They drank, the flavor deep and complex, lingering on the palate like a beautiful haunting. Above them, the sky turned to shades of crimson and violet, a sunset worthy of a final toast. Their love was never meant to be a light summer spritz. It was a heavy, dark port meant to be savored in the winter of their lives. In the end, the greatest treasures were not found in royal vaults or dusty cellars. They were found in the moments when two souls finally breathed together. It was a love that flickered with the beauty of royal secret flames, burning bright against the darkness of the world. And like the rarest vintage, theirs was a love meant to be savored, slowly, deeply, and forever. The end. Or perhaps, just the beginning. May you have enjoyed this journey through the shadows. May your nights be rich, your secrets aged well, and your heart brave enough to uncork its own forbidden vintage. Until the next tale, let the royal secret flames burn on. If this story stirred your soul, surround yourself with the same timeless beauty. Visit the Royal Secret Flames Atelier for museum-quality Old Masters reproductions. Perfect for creating your own sanctuary of shadows and art.